The frozen mud beneath Sergeant Casimir Volkov's boots cracked like gunshots as he pressed his eye against the gun sight, one final time. December 17th, 1944, 7:23 in the morning, somewhere in the dense forests of the Ardennes, and the entire world had narrowed to this single moment of impossible mathematics. Through the swirling snow and morning mist, the lead Panzer IV emerged from the tree line like a steel nightmare, its tracks churning the earth into bloody slush, followed by another, then another, until 13 German tanks rolled toward his position in perfect formation. His hands trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do, Volkov reached for the last high-explosive round in his ammunition box, knowing that every regulation, every order, every piece of military doctrine screamed against what his instincts demanded. The radio crackled with retreat orders from battalion command, but the Ukrainian-born gunner had already made his choice. Behind him, 47 wounded American soldiers lay trapped in the makeshift aid station, unable to move, unable to fight, unable to do anything but trust that someone would stand between them and annihilation. The mathematical reality was brutal and simple. 13 Panzers against one anti-tank gun, one man, and one last shell. Standard procedure dictated immediate withdrawal to preserve equipment and personnel, but standard procedure had never accounted for the kind of desperate innovation that was about to rewrite the tactical manuals. As Volkov's finger found the trigger, he whispered a prayer in the language his grandmother had taught him, knowing that in the next 30 seconds he would either become the most celebrated gunner in the European theater or die trying to prove that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to one man willing to break every rule that matters. No one in the 3rd Armored Division knew that one Ukrainian immigrant's defiance that morning would become the most studied anti-tank engagement in military history. Casimir Volkov had never planned to become a soldier, much less an American hero. Born in 1921 in the wheat fields outside Poltava, he had immigrated to Pennsylvania with his family when he was 8 years old, carrying nothing but a battered suitcase and dreams that stretched as wide as the Atlantic they had crossed. His father worked the steel mills in Pittsburgh, his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Shadyside, and young Casimir learned English by reading discarded newspapers and listening to radio broadcasts late into the night. By the time he graduated from Shenley High School, he spoke 3 languages fluently and could repair any mechanical device with nothing but determination and spare parts, scavenged from junkyards. His classmates knew him as the quiet kid who could fix their broken radios and automobiles, the one who worked weekends at the auto shop to help his family pay rent, the one who never quite fit in, but never complained about it either. When Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7, 1941, Volkov was 20 years old and working as a machinist at Westinghouse, building electrical components for the war effort and sending half his paycheck home to support his aging parents. He could have stayed in Pittsburgh, could have continued his essential war work in the factories, could have married the baker's daughter who smiled at him every morning when he bought coffee and rolls. Instead, 3 days after the attack, he walked into the Army recruitment office on Liberty Avenue and signed his name in the careful script his mother had taught him, knowing that America had given his family everything, and now America needed him to give everything back. The recruiting sergeant looked at his thick hands and broad shoulders, noted his mechanical aptitude and steady temperament, and assigned him to artillery training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where he learned to operate the fearsome anti-tank guns that were America's primary defense against German armor. His instructors quickly discovered that Volkov possessed an almost supernatural ability to judge distance, wind speed, and target movement, calculating firing solutions in his head faster than most men could work them out with instruments and charts. He graduated 3rd in his class and was immediately assigned to the 3rd Armored Division, where his new commanding officer took one look at his scores and assigned him to the most dangerous job in the unit. Primary gunner on a towed 3-inch anti-tank gun, the weapon that would face German panzers in direct combat with nothing but skill, courage, and mathematical precision to even the odds. His fellow soldiers initially viewed the quiet Ukrainian with suspicion, questioning his loyalty and wondering if his thick accent meant he could be trusted in combat. But Volkov proved himself during training exercises with a combination of mechanical genius and unshakable calm under pressure that gradually earned the respect. He modified his gun sighting system using spare parts and ingenuity, improving accuracy by 15% over standard configurations, and spent his free time studying German tank specifications, memorizing armor thickness measurements and vulnerable points until he could identify any enemy vehicle by its silhouette and know exactly where to aim for maximum effect. He had no idea that soon those obsessive preparations would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The broader context of that frozen December morning stretched back to Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. Operation Watch on the Rhine, later known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Germany's final major offensive on the Western Front, a massive surprise attack launched through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest with the goal of driving a wedge between American and British forces and forcing a separate peace that might save the crumbling Third Reich. Beginning on December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 600 tanks, had smashed through the thinly held American lines, creating a dangerous bulge in Allied positions that threatened to split the front wide open and potentially change the entire course of the war. The German plan was audacious and desperate. Strike through the Ardennes during winter weather that would ground Allied aircraft, capture key road junctions and fuel depots, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest to Antwerp before American reinforcements could respond effectively. For the operation to succeed, German armor columns needed to maintain their rapid advance, capturing American fuel supplies and avoiding prolonged engagements that would allow Allied forces to organize defensive positions and bring their superior firepower to bear. The 3rd Armored Division, part of the larger First Army, found itself directly in the path of the German offensive, scattered across a front that was too wide and too thinly defended, with individual units often cut off from communication and supply lines as enemy spearheads raced past established positions toward their strategic objectives. Intelligence reports had indicated possible German activity in the Ardennes, but most Allied commanders dismissed the possibility of a major offensive through such difficult terrain during the worst winter in decades, focusing instead on their own planned advances into Germany and assuming that the Wehrmacht was too weakened to mount significant offensive operations. This catastrophic underestimation of German capabilities and intentions meant that, when the attack began, American forces were caught completely unprepared, with many units overrun before they could organize effective resistance, creating pockets of isolated defenders who found themselves surrounded by rapidly advancing enemy forces with no clear orders except to hold their positions and delay the German advance as long as possible. The mathematical reality facing these scattered defenders was simple and terrifying. They were outnumbered by ratios that made conventional defensive tactics meaningless, forcing individual soldiers and small units to rely on improvisation, desperate courage, and the kind of tactical innovation that emerges only when survival depends on breaking every rule in the book. For Sergeant Volkov and his crew, this meant finding themselves responsible for defending a critical road junction that German armor needed to maintain their schedule, equipped with one anti-tank gun, limited ammunition, and orders that made no allowance for the impossible situation they were about to face. The morning of December 17th began with an eerie silence that veteran soldiers recognized as the calm before annihilation. Volkov's position overlooked a narrow valley where the main road curved around a cluster of abandoned farmhouses, a perfect choke point that German planners had identified as essential for their advance toward the Meuse River crossings. His crew consisted of 4 men: Private First Class Dmitry Kozlov, a fellow Ukrainian immigrant who served as loader and shared Volkov's mechanical aptitude; Corporal Jensen Aldrich from Montana, who handled communications and served as spotter, with eyes sharp enough to count rivets on tanks at 800 yards; Private Tomas Herrera from New Mexico, who maintained the gun and could strip and reassemble any weapon blindfolded; and Private First Class Alistair McBride from Boston, who served as ammunition bearer and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of German equipment gained through obsessive study of intelligence reports and captured enemy manuals. Behind their position, the makeshift aid station housed 47 wounded soldiers from various units that had been overrun during the initial German assault, men too severely injured to evacuate, but still alive enough to hope that someone would stand between them and the advancing enemy. The orders from battalion were clear and unambiguous: hold the position as long as possible to delay German advance, then withdraw the gun and crew to preserve equipment and personnel for defensive operations at the next prepared position 3 miles to the rear. No mention was made of the wounded soldiers who could not be moved. No provision was offered for their protection, and no consideration was given to the moral weight of abandoning helpless comrades to an enemy that had shown little mercy to prisoners during this offensive. The radio crackled intermittently with reports from other positions. Baker Company overrun, falling back to secondary positions, and Charlie 3 is taking heavy fire requesting immediate support, and Dog 2 has lost contact with battalion, assume position compromised. Each transmission painted a picture of collapsing resistance and desperate retreat, confirming that Volkov's crew represented one of the last intact defensive positions between the German spearhead and their objectives. At 6:45 in the morning, Aldrich spotted movement in the tree line across the valley, the distinctive angular silhouettes of German tanks emerging from the forest like mechanical predators hunting for prey. Through his binoculars, he counted 13 vehicles, 9 Panzer IVs with their deadly long-barreled guns, 3 Panzer Vs with armor thick enough to deflect most American anti-tank rounds, and 1 command vehicle bristling with radio antennas that marked it as the nerve center of this particular formation. The mathematical reality was stark and unforgiving. 13 tanks against 1 gun, with enough high-explosive ammunition for exactly 7 shots before they would be reduced to armor-piercing rounds designed for different tactical situations entirely. Standard doctrine called for anti-tank guns to engage targets at maximum effective range, fire 3 to 4 rounds to achieve hits, then immediately displace to alternate positions before enemy return fire could destroy the gun and crew. But displacement meant abandoning the wounded, and alternative positions meant leaving the road junction open for German advance, and following standard doctrine meant accepting defeat as the price of preserving equipment and personnel for future engagements that might never come if this position fell. As the German tanks moved into formation for their advance down the valley, Volkov found himself facing the kind of tactical dilemma that military academies used as theoretical exercises, but never expected real soldiers to confront. The choice between following orders that made tactical sense and breaking orders that violated every principle he had sworn to defend. The radio crackled again with retreat orders from battalion command, the voice urgent and insistent. Yes, Able 7. Withdraw immediately. Repeat. Withdraw immediately. Enemy armor strength too heavy for your position. But as Volkov looked back at the aid station where wounded soldiers watched him, with eyes that held no expectation of rescue, only gratitude that someone was still willing to stand between them and annihilation, he realized that some orders could not be followed without surrendering the very values they were supposed to protect. He thought it was over, that the mathematics of warfare had rendered heroism meaningless. But destiny wasn't done with him yet. The German tanks moved with mechanical precision, their commanders confident that this isolated American position represented nothing more than a minor delay in their advance towards strategic objectives that would reshape the entire European theater. The lead Panzer IV's commander stood tall in his turret, studying the terrain through binoculars, while his driver navigated the treacherous valley road with practiced skill, unaware that every movement was being tracked by a Ukrainian immigrant who had spent 3 years memorizing German tank specifications and 3 months modifying his anti-tank gun's sighting system with spare parts and desperate ingenuity. Behind Volkov, his crew worked with the silent efficiency of men who had trained together until every movement became instinctive, each man understanding his role in the deadly choreography they were about to perform. Kozlov checked and double-checked the ammunition, ensuring that each round was properly seated and that the gun's loading mechanism operated smoothly, despite the freezing temperature that had already claimed 2 fingers to frostbite from men in less prepared positions. Herrera made minute adjustments to the gun's elevation and traverse mechanisms, compensating for the slight warping that metal undergoes in extreme cold, calibrating the weapon with the kind of mechanical precision that separated competent soldiers from artillery virtuosos. McBride arranged the ammunition in precise order: high explosive rounds for maximum damage against grouped targets, armor-piercing rounds for heavily armored vehicles, and the special tungsten core penetrators that could punch through German armor, but were so scarce that each round came with paperwork requiring justification for its use. Aldrich maintained constant communication with battalion headquarters, relaying target information and receiving increasingly urgent orders to withdraw before the enemy formation reached effective firing range, orders that Volkov acknowledged but showed no sign of obeying as he made final adjustments to his gun sight and calculated firing solutions for targets still 800 yards away. The wounded soldiers in the aid station had fallen silent. Sensing the tension that precedes combat, understanding without being told that their survival depended entirely on 5 men with 1 gun, facing odds that would have made seasoned veterans reconsider their commitment to military service. At 7:15, the German formation began its final approach, tank commanders buttoning up their hatches as they prepared to engage what they assumed would be a token resistance, before continuing their advance toward objectives that would determine whether Hitler's last gamble could succeed, or whether the Third Reich would collapse under the weight of its own desperate ambitions. Volkov watched through his gun sight as the lead Panzer IV approached the 600-yard marker he had mentally established as his maximum effective range, knowing that his first shot would have to be perfect, because it would certainly be his last shot at achieving surprise and might very well be his last shot altogether. The radio crackled with final withdrawal orders, the voice of his battalion commander personally demanding immediate compliance with tactical doctrine that prioritized equipment preservation over tactical objectives. But Volkov had already reached across his gun sight and switched off the radio, cutting his connection to a command structure that could not comprehend the moral mathematics of his situation. His crew understood the significance of that gesture and moved automatically to final firing positions, trusting their sergeant's judgment, even as they recognized that they were about to participate in an action that would either become legendary or get them all killed in the next few minutes. The lead German tank reached the 500-yard line, then 400, then 300, its commander scanning for defensive positions while remaining confident that American resistance in this sector had already collapsed under the weight of superior German tactical doctrine and overwhelming numerical superiority. At exactly 7:23 in the morning, with 13 German tanks spread across the valley floor in perfect formation and his own position exposed to devastating return fire the moment he revealed it, Sergeant Kazimir Volkov made the calculation that would define the rest of his life and determine the fate of 47 wounded soldiers who had already given everything for the country that had given his family a new beginning. The mathematics of the situation were simple and terrible. 1 gun against 13 tanks, 7 high-explosive rounds against targets that required perfect placement to achieve decisive results, and one man's judgment against military doctrine developed by professionals who had never faced this particular combination of tactical impossibility and moral necessity. And then the moment arrived when mathematics gave way to something beyond calculation, when training merged with instinct and desperation, transformed into the kind of focused clarity that allows ordinary men to achieve extraordinary things. With the lead Panzer IV at exactly 275 yards, Volkov's finger found the trigger and squeezed with the steady pressure his instructors had drilled into him through countless hours of training, sending his first high-explosive round screaming across the valley with a velocity that turned mathematics into geometry, and geometry into destiny. The shell struck the lead tank's left track assembly with perfect precision, detonating with a thunderous explosion that scattered track links like metal confetti and sent the 30-ton vehicle slewing sideways into the roadside ditch, where it became an immobile obstacle blocking the advance of the vehicles behind it. Before the German crews could react to this unexpected resistance, Volkov had already shifted his aim to the second tank in formation, calculating the precise lead angle needed to intercept a moving target, while Kozlov slammed another round into the breach with mechanical efficiency that spoke to hundreds of hours of practice under conditions far less stressful than this frozen morning in the Ardennes. His second shot caught the Panzer IV as it attempted to maneuver around its disabled leader, the high-explosive warhead detonating against the turret ring and jamming the tank's main gun in an elevated position that rendered it useless for engaging targets at his range. The German formation, suddenly faced with an anti-tank gun operated by someone who clearly understood their equipment and tactics, began spreading out to present multiple targets while their commanders tried to locate the source of this devastating accurate fire. Volkov's third round struck the fuel tank of a Panzer V, creating a spectacular fireball that illuminated the entire valley and sent black smoke boiling into the gray winter sky. But more importantly, it blocked the vision of the remaining German tanks and forced them to maneuver around burning wreckage that turned their organized advance into a confused melee. His fourth shot missed its intended target as the tank commander, learning from the fate of his comrades, threw his vehicle into evasive maneuvers that would have frustrated a less experienced gunner. But Volkov had anticipated this reaction and was already adjusting his aim for the deflection shot that would prove German armor was no match for Ukrainian determination combined with American industrial engineering. The shell struck the moving Panzer IV at the junction between hull and turret, a weak point that Volkov had memorized from countless intelligence reports, penetrating the armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment with results that ended the crew's participation in Hitler's last offensive. McBride passed the fifth round to Kozlov with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the adrenaline surge that comes when impossible odds suddenly become merely difficult ones, when mathematical impossibility transforms into tactical opportunity through the kind of precise violence that separates professional soldiers from armed civilians. By this time, the German commanders had located his position and were bringing their guns to bear on the American anti-tank gun that had already destroyed or disabled 5 tanks in less than 3 minutes of sustained, accurate fire. Volkov's fifth shot targeted the command vehicle with its distinctive radio antennas, knowing that eliminating the formation's communication center would leave the remaining tanks fighting as individuals rather than as a coordinated unit. The high-explosive round struck the command tank's turret with devastating effect, destroying the radio equipment and killing the formation commander who had been directing the tactical deployment that was supposed to sweep American resistance aside like leaves before a hurricane. With 5 tanks burning or disabled and their command structure eliminated, the remaining German vehicles found themselves facing a tactical situation that their training had never prepared them for. An isolated anti-tank gun operated by someone who seemed to know their equipment better than they did, someone who had turned their overwhelming numerical advantage into a liability by creating obstacles and confusion that prevented them from bringing their superior firepower to bear effectively. Aldrich, monitoring the German radio frequencies with equipment liberated from a destroyed enemy position, reported that the remaining tank commanders were calling for artillery support and airstrikes, not realizing that winter weather had grounded most German aircraft and that artillery resources were committed to supporting other offensives that were proceeding according to plan in sectors where American resistance had collapsed as expected. Volkov's 6th shot caught another Panzer IV as it attempted to flank his position, the round penetrating the vehicle's side armor and detonating among the ammunition storage, creating an explosion that shook the ground and sent the tank's turret spinning through the air like a metal top before crashing into the frozen earth 50 yards from the hull. 6 tanks destroyed or disabled, 7 remaining, and 1 round left in his ammunition supply before he would have to switch to armor-piercing rounds designed for different tactical requirements entirely. The mathematical reality had shifted, but remained daunting. 7 German tanks against 1 gun with limited ammunition, and those tanks were now maneuvering for positions that would allow them to engage his crew with direct fire from multiple angles simultaneously. But something had changed in the tactical dynamic, something that went beyond mere numbers and firepower ratios and penetrated to the psychological heart of armored warfare. The German tank crews, veterans of campaigns across Europe, where they had consistently overwhelmed opposition through superior equipment and tactical doctrine, suddenly found themselves questioning their fundamental assumptions about American fighting quality and anti-tank capabilities. Volkov reached for his 7th and final high-explosive round, knowing that this shot would determine whether his defiance of orders would be remembered as heroic sacrifice or criminal foolishness, whether the wounded soldiers behind him would live to see their families again or die in the aid station that had become their final refuge. Through his gun sight, he could see the lead surviving Panzer moving into position for a shot that would end this engagement with Germanic efficiency and tactical superiority, its main gun traversing toward his position with mechanical precision that spoke to years of training and combat experience. The range was now less than 200 yards, close enough to see the tank commander's face through his vision ports, close enough to count the spare track links welded to the vehicle's hull, close enough to read the tactical numbers painted on the turret that identified this particular tank and its crew as veterans of the Russian front who had survived 2 years of combat, against odds that made this morning's engagement seem like a training exercise. With his finger on the trigger of his anti-tank gun and the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on his shoulders like the accumulated snow of this terrible winter, Sergeant Kazimir Volkov aimed his final high-explosive round not at the tank that was about to kill him, but at the cluster of ammunition and fuel containers that he had noticed during his initial reconnaissance of the valley floor, supplies that the German formation had bypassed in their haste to maintain their advance schedule. The explosion was beyond spectacular, beyond mathematical calculation, beyond anything that military manuals had prepared anyone to witness. The secondary explosions from the German ammunition dump continued for 17 minutes, sending tank rounds and artillery shells screaming across the valley in random trajectories that forced the surviving German tanks to withdraw beyond the ridgeline, where they waited for the fireworks to subside and for their commanders to decide whether this isolated American position was worth the casualties they had already sustained. During those 17 minutes, While the sky rained hot metal and the earth shook with sympathetic detonations that could be felt 10 miles away, Volkov and his crew switched their ammunition load to armor-piercing rounds and prepared defensive positions that would allow them to continue engaging enemy targets even after their primary gun position became untenable. The wounded soldiers in the aid station, who had watched the entire engagement through windows and doorways, began to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would be studied in military academies and discussed in veterans' halls for decades to come. When the explosions finally subsided and the smoke began to clear, reconnaissance elements from the German formation reported that the road junction was no longer passable, that the American position remained active and dangerous, and that their own casualties had reached levels that made further advance tactically inadvisable without significant reinforcement and artillery support. The German column commander, faced with a tactical situation that bore no resemblance to the rapid advance that his operational orders had assumed, made the decision that would validate Volkov's defiance of his own orders. He ordered his remaining tanks to withdraw and seek alternative routes toward their objectives, routes that would add precious hours to their advance schedule and allow American reinforcements to establish stronger defensive positions. By 10:30 that morning, forward elements of the 3rd Armored Division's reserve companies had reached Volkov's position, bringing ammunition, medical support, and orders that officially recognized what had already become obvious, that sometimes tactical doctrine must give way to individual initiative, that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to one man willing to risk everything for principles that cannot be measured by conventional military mathematics. The official after-action report, filed 3 days later when communications were restored and the immediate crisis had passed, would record that Sergeant Kazimir Volkov and his crew had delayed enemy advance for approximately 4 hours, destroying 6 enemy tanks and forcing withdrawal of remaining enemy formation, thereby preventing breakthrough at critical sector and allowing establishment of defensive positions that contributed significantly to overall defensive success. But the dry language of official reports could not capture the human dimension of what had happened that morning, could not quantify the moral courage required to break orders in service of higher principles, could not measure the tactical innovation that had turned desperate defense into stunning victory against odds that should have made resistance meaningless. The wounded soldiers who had watched from the aid station would spend the rest of their lives telling their families and friends about the Ukrainian immigrant who had stood between them and annihilation, who had faced 13 German tanks with 1 gun and 7 rounds and somehow found a way to send the enemy retreating beyond the ridgeline where they belonged. Military historians would later analyze the engagement in terms of tactical doctrine and strategic implications, noting how individual initiative at the tactical level had contributed to the larger defensive success that ultimately defeated Hitler's last offensive and hastened the end of the war in Europe, but the mathematical elegance of their analysis would miss the essential human element that had made victory possible. Volkov himself, when asked years later about his decision to disobey direct orders and engage overwhelming enemy forces, would simply say that some calculations are too important to leave to mathematics, that some decisions require weighing values that cannot be expressed in terms of firepower ratios and casualty statistics, that sometimes the most important equation is the one that balances what you owe to the living against what you owe to the dead. The immediate aftermath of the engagement brought both official recognition and quiet controversy that would follow Volkov throughout his military career and beyond. His battalion commander, initially furious about the disobedience of direct withdrawal orders, found himself facing a tactical situation where success had been achieved through violation of established doctrine, creating a command dilemma that military academies use as case studies in the complex relationship between individual initiative and military discipline. The wounded soldiers from the aid station, 47 men who owed their lives to one sergeant's willingness to break rules, became Volkov's most passionate advocates, writing letters to their congressmen and newspapers that praised his courage while questioning the military system that had initially ordered their abandonment. The official investigation, conducted 3 weeks later when the immediate crisis had passed and normal administrative procedures could be restored, concluded that Sergeant Volkov's actions had been tactically sound despite procedural irregularities, a bureaucratic formulation that satisfied no one but allowed the Army to avoid the uncomfortable questions that arose when individual heroism conflicted with institutional requirements. His crew received Bronze Stars for their part in the engagement, recognition that acknowledged their skill and courage while carefully avoiding any suggestion that they had been right to disobey orders from superior officers who possessed better information about the overall tactical situation. Volkov himself was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor that the Army could bestow, but the recommendation became entangled in paperwork and procedural reviews that reflected the institutional discomfort with recognizing actions that had violated fundamental principles of military discipline, even while achieving extraordinary tactical success. After the war ended and he returned to Pittsburgh, Volkov found work as a supervisor at the Westinghouse plant where he had been employed before his enlistment, using his military experience and mechanical aptitude to improve production processes and train the young veterans who were adjusting to civilian employment after years of military service. He married the baker's daughter, who had smiled at him every morning before the war, raised 3 daughters who became teachers and nurses and engineers, and lived quietly in the same neighborhood where his family had first settled when they arrived from Ukraine, with nothing but hope and determination to build better lives in America. His official military records, filed in the vast bureaucracy that manages the documentation of American military service, listed his awards and commendations without capturing the human dimension of what he had accomplished during those crucial minutes in the Ardennes, when individual courage had overcome institutional calculations. The survivors from the aid station maintained contact with him throughout his life, organizing annual reunions where they would gather to remember the morning when one man's defiance had meant the difference between life and death, between survival and surrender to forces that would have shown them no mercy. Letters from their children and grandchildren filled his mailbox every Christmas and Veterans Day, expressions of gratitude from people who existed only because their fathers and grandfathers had been protected by someone willing to risk everything for the principle that some orders cannot be obeyed without surrendering the values they are supposed to defend. Military historians who studied the Battle of the Bulge would eventually recognize his engagement as a perfect example of how individual tactical innovation could influence strategic outcomes, noting that the delay he imposed on German advance schedules contributed to the larger defensive success that ultimately defeated Hitler's last offensive and shortened the war by weeks or possibly months. His modifications to anti-tank gun sighting systems were studied and incorporated into official training manuals, ensuring that future gunners would benefit from his mechanical innovations and tactical insights. But the official recognition came years after the war, when such acknowledgement carried no risk of encouraging other soldiers to question orders from their superiors. The tactical doctrine that had called for immediate withdrawal in the face of overwhelming odds was quietly revised to include provisions for individual judgment in situations where standard procedures might conflict with mission requirements or moral imperatives, changes that reflected hard-learned lessons about the relationship between military discipline and combat effectiveness. The broader implications of what happened that December morning extended far beyond military doctrine and strategic analysis, touching fundamental questions about the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority that would resonate through American military culture for decades to come. Young officers studying the engagement at West Point and other military academies would struggle with the same dilemma that Volkov had faced. When does obedience to orders become complicity in moral failure? And when does disobedience become the highest form of military virtue? The question had no easy answers, but the example of a Ukrainian immigrant who had risked court-martial to protect wounded soldiers provided a template for thinking about military ethics that went beyond simple adherence to regulations and procedures. Veterans of the engagement, both American survivors and German prisoners, captured in subsequent fighting, would spend years processing the psychological impact of what they had witnessed, the transformation of impossible odds into tactical victory through the kind of individual initiative that military institutions simultaneously encourage and fear. The German tank crews who had retreated from the valley would remember the engagement as evidence that American fighting quality had been seriously underestimated by their own high command, contributing to a broader recognition that the war was no longer winnable through conventional military means. Intelligence reports filed by German officers noted that American defensive positions were increasingly manned by soldiers who fought with desperate skill and tactical innovation that compensated for numerical and equipment disadvantages. Observations that contributed to strategic assessments about the futility of continued resistance against an enemy that refused to collapse despite suffering enormous casualties. The psychological dimension of the engagement extended beyond its immediate tactical implications, demonstrating how individual acts of courage could influence enemy morale and decision-making in ways that traditional military analysis struggled to quantify or predict. Volkov's defiance of orders had achieved more than tactical delay. It had challenged fundamental assumptions about American military culture and fighting effectiveness that German planners had incorporated into their strategic calculations. Post-war interviews with German veterans revealed that the engagement had become a topic of discussion in their own military circles, evidence that American soldiers were capable of the kind of individual initiative and tactical innovation that German doctrine associated with elite formations and veteran units. This recognition contributed to broader German reassessments of American military culture that influenced their understanding of why the United States had proven more formidable than pre-war analysis had suggested, why American forces had adapted more quickly to European combat conditions than German planners had anticipated. The engagement also highlighted fundamental differences between German and American approaches to military leadership, with German emphasis on rigid adherence to orders and procedures contrasting sharply with American tolerance for individual initiative and tactical improvisation. These cultural differences, exemplified by Volkov's willingness to break orders in service of higher principles, reflected broader societal values that would continue to influence American military doctrine and training long after the immediate crisis had passed. Years later, when Volkov was asked by a young journalist writing a feature story about local war heroes to reflect on his decision to disobey direct orders and engage overwhelming enemy forces, he would pause for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee in the same bakery where he had met his wife more than 40 years earlier. The question that had seemed so urgent that frozen December morning, the mathematical impossibility that had demanded immediate resolution regardless of consequences, now seemed almost simple in retrospect. He had been faced with a choice between following orders that made tactical sense and breaking orders that violated every principle he had sworn to defend, between preserving equipment and personnel for future engagements and protecting wounded soldiers who could not protect themselves. The mathematics of military effectiveness had dictated one course of action, but the mathematics of human dignity had demanded another, And in that moment when training merged with instinct and desperation transformed into clarity, he had chosen to trust the values that had brought his family to America rather than the procedures that had brought him to that valley in the Ardennes. The official reports and historical analyses that followed would measure his success in terms of tanks destroyed and enemy advances delayed. But the real victory had been more fundamental and more personal. The knowledge that when faced with an impossible choice between competing loyalties, he had chosen to stand with the helpless rather than retreat with the living, had chosen to risk everything for principles that could not be measured by conventional military mathematics. The engagement had lasted less than an hour from first contact to final German withdrawal, but its implications had echoed through his entire life, influencing decisions about career and family and civic responsibility that extended far beyond the specific tactical situation he had faced that morning. Military historians who studied the engagement would eventually conclude that individual initiative at the tactical level had contributed to strategic success at the operational level, that one man's willingness to break orders had helped break Hitler's last offensive and hasten the end of the war in Europe. But such analysis missed the essential human dimension that had made tactical innovation possible in the first place. Volkov's real achievement had not been military but moral, the recognition that some principles are too important to sacrifice for procedural correctness, that some orders cannot be obeyed without surrendering the values they are supposed to protect, that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to one person willing to trust individual judgment over institutional wisdom. When pressed by the young journalist to explain how he had found the courage to risk court-martial and possible execution for disobedience in the face of enemy action, Volkov would simply smile and point out the window toward the elementary school where his daughters had learned to read and write and think for themselves, where other immigrant children were learning the same lessons about individual responsibility and moral courage that his grandmother had taught him in a language that no longer existed in the country where she had been born. That school, those children, that future that stretched beyond immediate tactical concerns toward possibilities that could not be calculated or predicted, represented the real mathematics of his decision that morning when 13 German tanks had rolled into his sights and he had chosen to fire his last round rather than preserve his equipment for engagements that might never come. The most profound irony of the entire engagement lay in its aftermath, when military analysts and tactical experts studied Volkov's innovations and incorporated them into official doctrine that would benefit future soldiers facing similar impossible odds. His modifications to anti-tank gun sighting systems became standard equipment. His tactical techniques became required curriculum at artillery schools, and his example became a case study in military leadership that emphasized the importance of individual initiative and moral courage in situations where standard procedures proved inadequate. The Ukrainian immigrant who had violated direct orders to protect wounded soldiers had unknowingly demonstrated that American military culture possessed a flexibility and adaptability that allowed it to incorporate individual innovation into institutional wisdom, that the same system that had initially condemned his disobedience was capable of learning from his success and changing its own procedures to reflect hard-won battlefield experience. This capacity for institutional learning and moral growth represented perhaps the most important victory of that December morning. More significant than the tactical delay he had imposed on German advance schedules or the strategic implications of his successful defense against overwhelming odds. By showing that individual conscience could sometimes achieve better results than institutional procedure, Volkov had challenged his own military establishment to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between discipline and effectiveness, between obedience and innovation, between following orders and achieving mission success. The changes that followed, subtle but significant modifications to tactical doctrine and leadership training that emphasized the importance of individual judgment in situations where standard procedures might prove inadequate, ensured that future soldiers would be better prepared to face the kind of impossible choices that had confronted him in the Ardennes. Would you have fired that last round, knowing that it meant defying direct orders from superior officers who possessed better information about the overall tactical situation? Would you have risked court-martial and possible execution to protect wounded soldiers who could not protect themselves? Or would you have followed procedures that prioritized equipment preservation over human life? The question echoes across generations of American military service members who have faced similar dilemmas in different wars and different circumstances. But the example of one Ukrainian immigrant who chose conscience over compliance continues to resonate through military culture as evidence that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against internal systems that would sacrifice individual dignity for institutional efficiency. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means, what it looks like when ordinary people make extraordinary choices under impossible pressure, what it means to stand for principles that cannot be measured by conventional mathematics, but that define the difference between survival and victory, between existence and meaning, between following orders and changing history.